Alrighty. So, hi everybody. Welcome to Reasonable Faith. Our second week, our first real talk. So, good to have you all here. In the way of announcements, this weekend is the first Saturday of the month, and thus it is going to be Pancakes and Pontification. Yay. So, that is going to be taking place at 7 p.m. on Saturday, September 6th. It is going to be in the Phase 8 clubhouse on campus, which is, we're in the science building, it's right over there. Like Phase 8 apartments is right over there. It's the clubhouse over there. We'll send more info in the Discord when that day comes. But yeah, and then next week we have a special talk coming up where we're going to be in a different room, a much larger room in Green Hall. And that is going to be our AI talk, which is going to be very interesting. AI obviously being quite a hot button issue nowadays. So it's going to be an interesting talk. As for tonight, we're going to be focusing on like gospel authorship and why, how is the canon actually composed? Why are the Gospels we have the ones we actually have in the Bible? Why not others? And so we're going to have our very own Hainline talking about that tonight. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to him.
Okay. Thank you, Seth. Good to see everybody. I was out last week. I was actually in Fiji, so missed you guys. But yeah, I'm excited about this talk, and I do hope that you all will invite some people to the AI talk coming up next week. He's driving in from Baylor, and Dr. Bob Marks is a really great speaker, really great guy. Some of you have heard him before, some of you may not have, but he runs an organization where they deal a lot with neuroscience, and they look a lot at artificial and natural intelligence. They discuss things related to evidence for the soul. And he's really knowledgeable. He's an IEEE fellow, one of the early sort of pioneers in AI, which is a field I work in a little bit myself. But it should be something that you could easily invite people, friends you have here, that it's not going to be very, Christian oriented, but he will probably work in a few things as far as like implications or speak just from a Christian worldview. But it'll be the kind of thing that'd be real easy to invite just any friend that's interested in the topic, and they won't feel like you're taking them to church if they're not into church or something like that. So anyway, that should be fun. But yeah, we're going to talk tonight about the Gospels. How many of y'all have seen the Da Vinci Code movie, or maybe has anybody read the book? Or it's kind of old at this point, so that's why I'm asking. I'm just curious. But that was one example, but there's many others as well, of people sort of spreading misinformation. Now, it was just a novel, right? But there was just a lot that they got wrong in that movie and book. And it's kind of annoying, right? Even people that are non-Christians kind of spoke against some of the errors propagated in that. But some of it related to there being all these other Gospels, and they should sort of be at the same level as the four that we find in our New Testament. And so we're going to kind of respond to that. And there are actually a number of, Ivy League scholars or whatever that I think are just way too skeptical toward the Gospels. And I think if we look at it historically, using the same criteria historians use in other areas, I think we'll see that we have good reason for thinking that we know who wrote these Gospels. It is the four they were attributed to. And that we're going to look at these other so-called Gospels and discuss those. Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas. Some of you may have heard of a lot of these. We're going to kind of compare and contrast those with the ones that we find in our New Testament. Was it just a political thing, or are there really reasons to think that, these four are actually more accurate history documents about Jesus than these other ones? So that's kind of the topic for tonight. So if we want to put the skeptical claim out there, we'll call on our good friend Bart Ehrman, common foil, but he is one of the top intellectuals who kind of speaks against Christianity. He's driven many people away from their Christian faith And the Muslims love him. They'll try to quote him to kind of put down the Bible, and it's been changed and all that kind of stuff. But one of his books called Jesus Interrupted, he had this quote. He said, "Some books, such as the Gospels, had been written anonymously, only later to be ascribed to certain authors who probably did not write them." So we want to respond to that claim. So I'm going to throw it out to you guys, though, just for discussion before we jump into a response. What do you think would be some good kind of criteria for evaluating, if you got some ancient document, how would you evaluate whether or not a certain person wrote that document? What are some things you'd be looking for?
A signature is sealed.
Okay, yeah, obviously if you have some information where they're claiming to write it, that's helpful.
If you know particular facts about that person's life or background, seeing those features kind of cropping into their writings.
Very good, both another good point. Excellent, okay, any other thoughts?
You have other works by them that you can confirm or actually by them here too.
Okay, yeah, is it a consistent style and things like that? Seth?
Making sure the works are actually in the same time period as whatever prospective author you're thinking.
Oh, there you go. That's a really key one, and that's one that'll be especially important as we look at these different Gospels today. All right. Yeah, so you hit on, I think, most of these. Another one you could look at that I didn't hear mentioned, but some of you probably thought of it, obviously, is just looking at if you have other people writing in these early time periods and saying, oh yeah, John wrote his gospel. That's some evidence anyway that maybe John wrote his gospel. If you've got that kind of information, you want to look at the whole cumulative case of all the data you have and kind of make a decision, but that would be one factor that could weigh in. Seth hit that one pretty well about getting the time right. And you could look at what they write about and how is it accurate historically? Does it match what we know to be true? And I'm excited for this talk coming September 30th, where we have Dr. Peter Williams in all the way from the United Kingdom speaking on that topic, Can We Trust the Gospels? Really great book. If you ever want a short book that's got academic depth by a scholar, but it's also really understandable. He worked really hard to make it as concise as possible. Anyway, he's going to give a really good talk kind of defending those aspects, which we've talked about some in here, but he's way more knowledgeable and can really do well with the Q&A and everything. So I'm excited about that talk in particular. So yeah, I'm going to argue and give some reasons for thinking that we really have all four of these. We have these different factors for the canonical Gospels, but if you compare with these other Gospels, they really fall short in all of these areas. All right, what about the claim? So the first time anyone really challenged the traditional authorship of our four Gospels was not until about 400 AD. A guy named Faustus was starting to try to question that, and the great St. Augustine responded with some kind of powerful arguments. He says, why does no one doubt the genuineness of books attributed to Hippocrates? Hippocratic Oath, right? The great Greek founder of modern medicine, not modern, but some level of medicine. He says, because there's a succession of testimonies to the books from the time of Hippocrates to the present day, which makes it unreasonable either now or hereafter to have any doubt on the subject. And he goes on to argue that we have that with the Gospels. It's just like you've got a whole sequence of people with no rival tradition saying they wrote it. That's a pretty good argument for it. Not the only thing you could take into account. And he says, look, that's how we do all these other works. There's many works from ancient literature where you don't have the author himself saying, I wrote this. But scholars have been able to figure out pretty easily, because of this factor, who wrote them. And he says, how do we know the authorship of the works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Varro, and other similar writers, but by the unbroken chain of evidence? All right. So again, there was one other tiny little exception of somebody that was very obscure, I think, questioning it, but really largely this was the first scholar, you could say, that really tried to push back on the traditional authorship. So the fact that it took that long, I think, is significant as well. And then when you take a step back and you say, wait a minute, if they were going to make up authors, would you really have chosen these four? You guys are pretty knowledgeable in this group. Who would you have chosen, or what might you have done differently if you were just going to make up authors for the Gospels? Any drawbacks to the current ones?
They're more broken outcast,
Okay.
with a couple of exceptions, but
Yeah.
if the original gospel writers had no actual influence beyond their small group of people who also followed Jesus and were actually persecuted beyond that, so why not have it be written by a king from a far off land? Why not have it be written by a king who had died and it's an unreleased work or something?
Yeah, you could get more prominent figures. What else, Seth?
I mean, if we're just thinking about like what names that we really want to ascribe to these, probably the names of the actual apostles and not just randomly Mark and Luke who weren't actually apostles.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think, if we were making things up and we were trying to form this religion years ago, we probably wouldn't have chosen Mark. He was kind of an obscure figure.
It would be weird not to attribute anything to Jesus himself if you're making something up.
Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that would have been a temptation, right, to say, well, yeah, this is directly from Jesus, written by him. And then, of course, even with Matthew, I mean, he's one of the 12, but he was a tax collector, and Jews hated tax collectors, as most people know. So he probably wouldn't have been the first choice. And do remember, with the case of Mark, there was that incident in Acts. He was sort of a failed missionary, so to speak. There was a split between Paul and Barnabas because he kind of abandoned them on one journey. He redeemed himself, and he was later very much accepted by the Apostle Paul, but apparently, he had some issues. And most people, it's not 100% sure, but you always hear people say that Luke was Gentile. He probably was. And it was admitted by the early church fathers that Luke himself was not an eyewitness of Jesus, but that he interviewed eyewitnesses, which is the very thing he claims in the book of Luke. And he is one of the greatest historians of ancient history. It's been pretty well established by people that were kind of hostile to that concept when they went and actually studied it, like Sir William Ramsay. They came away saying Luke should be considered among the greatest historians. When you combine the work of Luke with Acts, and that kind of goes along with Evan's point, that's an example where we can compare those and see that quite obviously Luke wrote that. Now the other thing, if you hear Ehrman or some other people, I kind of had a misconception myself on this until a number of years ago, but it sounds like the original documents are fully anonymous and all that, which in one sense it looks like we do find them in all our earliest manuscripts. Let me just show you some of the data here. But if you look at all of these early documents where we have the Gospels, it actually does say on there, it'll say something like according to Matthew, Gospel according to Matthew, etc. So it may not have been written by Matthew himself, or maybe he did. That's sort of irrelevant. But if all of your earliest documents where you have the top, or occasionally it comes at the end, but as you can see, there's a few of those. If basically all of your early copies do say they're from this person, I don't think you should necessarily call it anonymous. It's a little bit misleading the way it's presented to the audience that wouldn't know better by people like Ehrman. Yeah.
The way I understand it is that these are like the complete or the more so complete manuscripts.
Yeah, you have small scraps. Yeah.
But you wouldn't expect to find a name on whatever it is, the tiny credit card.
P52. Yeah, it's just a small part of John.
Yeah. I was looking at the dates, and the dates
They might bother you that they're a little bit late.
early, but yeah, for
You're wanting to get the whole manuscript. It's a lot harder than people realize to get full documents of any ancient writing. In fact, 85% of everything written in the 2nd century is completely lost. We have no scrap of any of it that's discernible anyway. And the situation's worse for the 1st century. So in other words, you'll have people writing about, oh, there's this book, blah, 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 but we just can't find that book that's referenced in other writing. And so much of that material was lost because it was written on papyrus, which decay rapidly in humidity and things like that. So yeah, I mean, you do have, late second and third. You have a few things going back really far, but yeah, it's more of an artifact of just the lack of complete copies. And often you could lose something at the beginning or end that might get the most wear. So Dan Wallace, his office is just really close to here, but he's the head of this Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts I've mentioned before. He goes around the world with his group, and they digitize these copies of Greek manuscripts. So he's seen more of these than anybody else. He's even seen Codex Vaticanus, even though he's a Protestant. They let him in there to see that at the Vatican, which is kind of cool. So anyway, yeah, he's also told me that, in person, like, yeah, he's seen these. And I think you could go online to csntm.org and probably find pictures of most of these. Well, maybe not probably over half anyway. It's a big project trying to get all that digitized because you have to get special permission and they're scattered all over the place. Anyway, I digress. But yeah, more about this chain of attribution that you have from different people, that the Gospels were indeed written by the four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So we could start with Tertullian. He lived in Carthage, which is near Tunis, which is where Tunis, Tunisia. That's where my daughter lives now, actually, and I'm going to go visit them in a couple weeks. Clement of Alexandria, that's in Egypt. I'll show you a map because I think the geographical distribution is important here. Irenaeus of Lyons, and we have a Muratorian fragment. We're kind of moving closer in time to the Gospels, as you can see here. You get to Justin Martyr in 150, Papias in what's modern-day Turkey. He was himself directly discipled by the Apostle John, and there is the map. So this is pretty far. So if you wanted to change the text of a gospel, if you wanted to go in and say, oh, I'm going to write this was according to John, that would be one you would want to make up. He was one of the inner circle of apostles. But how hard would that be? Well, if you have a distribution of these documents all over the place, and you have these church leaders who have an opinion about it, how do you get everybody in sync? I think lost in many moderns is realizing just how hard it was to travel and the reliance on physical documents, not digital. It's really hard to go around and fake this if you were to try to go and add these titles to all these documents. I mean, you could argue, the skeptic could say, well, yeah, they just did it really early on or something. But then it's also harder to get away with it if you have knowledgeable people at the time when you're distributing it that would know better. But the key point is we have this long attribution. There hasn't really been anybody that raised an objection to it until 300 plus years later, as I mentioned. And we do see very early referencing of the documents. So as early, for example, as 107, Ignatius in his letter to Polycarp says, he quotes something that's really from Matthew 10, in all circumstances be wise as a serpent and perpetually harmless as a dove. So we see things from the New Testament showing up very early on. And Polycarp, who we just mentioned, he sort of quotes from Luke here, blessed are the poor and those persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of God. And what you actually see that's interesting too, that Tim McGrew's pointed out, who's a key reference on some of this material, some of you know him from when he spoke in person here, but he's pointed out that if you look at the early church fathers and you find short quotations, they usually will just be kind of a paraphrase because they're doing it from memory. But when you get to a long quote from the Bible, it'll be perfect, basically, as far as we can tell, right? There's a few textual questions here and there, but it looks like they had access, they went ahead and looked it up because they didn't remember it. So you see some really interesting features like that. The other thing that's insignificant is that when they do quote from the New Testament, they'll say things like, remember when our Lord said. And so it was implicit that readers would know the Gospels because they were being read in the churches. and that, it's like he didn't have to say, oh, this was from this document that describes Jesus. It was just taken for granted in those writings. I'm going to go ahead and close this door. I don't have the strongest voice. All right, let's see here. I'm going to go a little faster here, make sure we cover more stuff. So yeah, you have Justin Martyr talking about the memoirs of Jesus, which he later called Gospels. That he says they were written by apostles and their followers. He mentioned certain events found in them. Justin Martyr's Pupiltation produced this harmony of 4 Gospels, which was called the Diatessaron, which means through the 4. So obviously you'd think that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? Well, apparently some German scholars, how there's some famous skeptical German scholars, they thought, oh no, it can't be John. That was written, much later. There's no way it's John. Because they didn't have this document until like 1888. And then they found it, and it was discovered that actually it starts off, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's a prologue of the Gospel of John right there at the beginning. It definitely has John in it. It's definitely the 4. It basically has everything from the 4. I think they left out the genealogies is about it. And you don't have extraneous things not found in the Gospel. So that's significant. Okay, do the Gospels look like what the claimed author would have written? John was a fisherman, right? Which goes along with David's point. Like, if you were making this up, would you have this uneducated fisherman be an author? Maybe not, although he was a prominent apostle. But, if you look at the Greek there, a lot of times for people, it might be the first thing they read in Greek. I know, like, my daughter just learned Greek because her husband was studying in seminary, and she's like, yeah, I'm starting to read John because it's the easiest one. It really is it's more of a subset of Greek vocabulary. And you can find Aramaisms, what scholars would say are, it looks like someone is a native, their first language is Aramaic. That's what they spoke in first century Palestine. And so they knew Greek some. Even as a fisherman, you might have to use that for commerce. So they would know some, and then if you're an apostle and you want to write it down, you'd probably learn more, right? So he could probably write in Greek. There's no reason to think he wouldn't have been able to, even though some people try to raise that objection. But you see signs that he wasn't terribly educated, but it also made it easy to understand. I mean, you can see why God might inspire books that way as well. And we have information from the church fathers such as Papias saying that Mark, his main source was from Peter. There's several others that affirm this as well. He was accompanying Peter when he was preaching in Rome and various things, and he would write down what he preached. Now, one objection to Matthew, you might remember if you're reading in the Gospel of Matthew when he talks about the calling of himself as a tax collector, he just speaks in the third person. And so some have said, well, obviously it can't be Matthew because he used the third person. But if you look at other ancient biographies, it becomes apparent, even as Augustine actually pointed this out in some of his writings long ago. He's like, there's a lot of ancient biographers that spoke in the third person. Josephus, Thucydides, Xenophon. So it's not that unusual for them to have done that. Okay, Luke is an interesting one because in his gospel or in the book of Acts, he never says, hey, I'm a physician or something like that. But from Colossians, we know that he was. And you do see a lot more information whenever he's talking about anything where someone's got some kind of illness. Of course, Jesus healed a lot of people, right? So he'll reference just a little, he'll give a little more information or sometimes medical terms even that you don't see in the other gospels. So they might talk about Simon Peter's mother-in-law had a fever, but Luke will make sure and say, oh, it was a high fever, or this man was full of leprosy. The withered, he'll give you, well, it was the right hand that was withered. More significantly, though, he'll give these kind of details. The woman that had an issue of blood for 12 years, couldn't be healed, etc. And he does use the medical term for spinal curvature and edema in Luke 13 and 14. So that fits. That seems plausible. And the interesting thing, too, is that even a skeptical scholar like Ehrman if he's talking about what do we know about Jesus, and he does defend to the hyper-skeptical that Jesus existed and things like that, he has a whole book on that, and he'll say, yeah, the four Gospels are our best source about the life of Jesus. So even he, who makes a lot of money off of trying to make things skeptical, will admit that. And McGrew has pointed out I think, a significant point that if you look at early heretics, there's a group, how many of y'all know what Gnostics are, Gnosticism? It was, most of y'all do. I can tell you a little bit more about it. Starting in about the 2nd century, there was a number of people that wanted to sort of adopt some version of Christianity, but morph it in with Greek thought at the time. It was a form, you know how Plato has the cave analogy, and there's the forms. They were kind of anti-physical. The ultimate realities were beyond the physical. The Gnostics were very much anti-physical, to the point that they were like anti-marriage, just some really weird stuff. So that's probably why they didn't last too long. They weren't out having kids or something, although there were some ones that were also like libertine sexually within that movement, which is a weird combination. I think it was more of like, oh, the physical doesn't matter, we can do whatever we want, or very anti-physical. They would say things like, the God of the Old Testament was this, he wasn't the God, it was like some demiurge, that messed everything up, and the physical creation is terrible. So they had a very low view of like the earth and nature and some very non-Jewish kinds of things, which is also interesting. They're very anti-Old Testament, and yet they're trying to adopt and morph early Christianity in with some of their ideas. And so that was the Gnostics. So almost all these so-called other Gospels we find are what you would call Gnostic Gospels. The only one that may be more questionable that I can think of is the Gospel of Thomas. There he quotes from a number of things from the New Testament, and then he adds in, it's early enough that it's barely adding in Gnostic stuff, but you definitely have some Gnostic stuff there as well, big time. It's just mixed in with more stuff that's like, oh yeah, Jesus did say that, it's quoted in the Bible, whereas the later Gnostic Gospels are like, it's totally no relation at all to reality about Jesus as according to the other Gospels. So you have these early Gnostics admitting that these four Gospels existed. You have Marcion taking Luke, the most Gentile of the Gospels, right? Because it was written to Gentiles by a Gentile. And he's like, okay, this is kind of okay. I'm going to cut out the parts I don't like and things like that. But really, the other ones they would reject. Like they hated Matthew, way too Jewish. In Luke, Marcion would cut out the part about, oh, he can't be born of a Jewish maiden. We don't want any part of that. So yeah, the Gnostics it's weird that people would think that they're Christian, basically. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So the first references to any Gospels other than the four doesn't show up until at least 60 to 100 years later than references to our four Gospels. And they're very minimal references, very minimal documents. They found a number of them in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, a number of years ago, and that kind of created this resurgence of people writing stuff. Like they love to do every Easter, let's bash Christianity and let's point to these weird Egyptian documents that we found, things like that. So, we know they're forgeries, and even people like Ehrman or Elaine Pagels at Princeton University, who she really likes the Gnostic Gospels, they'll admit like, okay, yeah, we can't really trust they were written by any true apostle, even though they might bear names like Thomas and Judas and so forth. All right, by the way, yeah, there is this talk that I mentioned before, so yeah, make sure you guys plan on that. Invite friends from church or school or whatever. It's going to be really great. I should take this opportunity to mention we're a small enough group here. I think I could just tell everybody, like we're meeting both Bob Marks next Tuesday for dinner and Peter Williams. And if any of you guys want to join us, you're welcome to do so. we can try to get that information on Discord. Maybe don't invite 10 of your friends to that, but you can come. We'd love to have you out there, and you could ask these guys questions and stuff. And we don't have a place chosen yet, but we'll get word out on that when the time comes. But yeah, we're going to switch gears next to these other Gospels in more detail. But any questions or comments about the authorship part of the presentation? It really is pretty straightforward, right? It's a pretty strong case. But it's good to be aware of these things, I think, because you'll find scholars, even at good universities, kind of being hyper skeptical. It's really a double standard. It's like, let's just use the same standard we use for other documents by Plato and Socrates and whatever to our Gospels, and we don't have to say we're 100% sure. Maybe it was John's disciples and not him that wrote it. That wouldn't undermine Christianity. I personally think it was John. I mean, we have good evidence for that. But there's really no reason to think Christianity has any diminished probability of being true because of any authorship questions about the Gospels. All right, yeah, so we'll talk a little more then in the next half of this on other Gospels. So I mentioned the Da Vinci Code. It was a good novel, but it's amazing. There was like 80 million copies sold of that. It was a really big deal back when it came out, when you guys were like born or really young, but when the novel came out anyway. But so they would say things in here like, oh, there's more than 80 Gospels considered for the New Testament, which there's no one that really claims that. He just made up stuff. And yet this had all this influence because it sold so many copies. And then you'll have articles like this in Newsweek where it's like, they must not have peer reviewed this because no skeptical scholar would have agreed with some of the things said in this article. You should Google it sometime if you want to laugh. It talks about the New Testament being like copies of copies of copies. Like you're not, like he even said, I think, translations. Like you don't go back to the original Greek or something. It's really bizarre. So you'll find things in popular media or even in the academy that you really just need to cross-check with strong, scholarly, reason-based analysis. All right, yeah, look that up sometime. The Bible's so misunderstood, it's a sin, and I think the author was misunderstanding the Bible. Okay, should alternatives, I meant to not reveal that, but okay, actually, you guys probably know this or you just read it. What does the word gospel mean? Good, very good. Yeah, wow. So most of y'all probably knew that already, but okay, so we could ask the question, are these other Gospels conveying good news? Well, one interesting thing is they really are not news-oriented at all. You'll have things like the Gospel of Thomas, 114 sayings, no narrative. It's just Jesus said, Thomas said. There's nothing like, oh, this was the life of Christ. He went here and he did this. None of the Gnostic Gospels really have that kind of narrative to any degree at all. So there's not really even news. It's also significant that these Gnostic Gospels don't agree with each other. It was a movement based more on like secret knowledge. Like the way to salvation, it wasn't like Jesus offering himself through the sacrifice freely available to everyone. Let's proclaim it to the ends of the earth. It was the opposite. It was like, oh, Judas was the real apostle that was right about everything. And he had this secret knowledge. Read this gospel. And then the other group was like, no, it was Thomas. And they were just, making up secret. And it's not even revealed that clear. If you read the Gospel of Thomas, and I heard some podcasts on this by secular scholars, and they're also like, I have no idea what this means. And they're like, they really think some of it is pretty bizarre. So that's a key difference. I mean, the reason it's called good news is because the 4 canonical Gospels are conveying that Jesus came, died for sins. There's this way to heaven through him. There's a way to have peace in this life and beyond through him. And you really don't have that in these other documents. And yeah, the whole thing, like if you look up in the dictionary, I did this to a couple of them, and they'll generally mention something about the life of Christ, the very thing missing in these other documents. So it's very misleading, I think, to call them gospels for those reasons. And yeah, as I mentioned, this really arose much later. And I think it's very significant that they're all, some to more degree, stronger degree than others, but they're all inconsistent with first century Jewish Palestinian culture where Jesus did live. You know, we know even from secular historians, as we've talked about before, like Tacitus or Josephus, that the movement started in Jerusalem. Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. This whole thing arose, you know, in this time window, and yet you don't have anybody believing in Gnosticism in that area, in that time, or anywhere at that time, really. So, which is more plausible, to think that, oh, these Gnostic Gospels got it right about Jesus, and these other ones were somehow faked, but they match the Jewish culture of the time where Jesus lived, and we have a lot more of them. They're better, you know, it just makes no sense to try to put these other documents on any kind of equal weight with the four. But you will find some secular scholars, you know, writing books called like the Five Gospels or something like that. They try to throw in Thomas, or Elaine Pagels, or Karen King at Harvard. They'll try to put these at somewhat of the same level as the four. So I've kind of beaten that horse to death. But let me mention just briefly also that, okay, Christ means Messiah, right? The Hebrew word Messiah in Greek is Christ. If something's Christian, it should relate to the Messiah. Well, none of those really deal with a Jewish Messiah at all, these other documents. And they're polytheistic. They don't fit in with Judaism at all. Some of them at least are very anti-Old Testament, as I've mentioned. You also lack the ethical focus you find in the four Gospels. David Marshall, who's written a book about this that I've got here, if anybody wants to check it out, The Truth About Jesus and the Lost Gospels. He's, in his analysis, he puts about 40 to 55% ethical content in our earliest parts of the Gospels versus 1% in the Gnostic Gospels. So they're not even giving you moral teaching very much in those documents. So just briefly to mention a little bit about Thomas, as I've already kind of introduced it a little bit. This one is probably the earliest one, and it's the most similar to the four. You should go online sometime and read it if you guys haven't. It's freely available. It's short. You can get an idea. It is 114 sayings. The first time anybody references this document, it's 220 AD. And Craig Evans and some other scholars discovered, even though some people like Elaine Pagels was trying to push it, say, oh, this might be first century document. But they found that it was copying some second century document, I think it was the Diatessaron actually, of Syriac Luke. So it was copying a mistake from this other document that originated in the second century. And so that's pretty hard to reconcile with it being a first century document. Because yeah, the Diatessaron would quote from Luke, but you know, it was a harmony of the Gospels. So it was rewording things. And so it had this exact wrong mistake that was made in that document propagated into the Gospel of Thomas. It does quote from 15 New Testament books as well. So if it was early, how would they have necessarily known about all the New Testament books at that time? Maybe they would have if it was late first century, but it would take a while for someone, you know, they weren't bundled together as well as quickly as you might think. All right, and there are some bizarre claims, as Seth was alluding to. Women, it says in the last saying, are unworthy. They have to become men to be saved. So I don't know why the feminists like these Gnostic Gospels. It doesn't sound too pro-women. It may be because some of the gods in there are female figures, so maybe they like that, but they're really not very positive about the women themselves the human women in these documents. Okay, what about the Gospel of Judas? This was also a known forgery. You find Irenaeus writing in the 2nd century about this document, saying it's a fictitious forgery. It teaches humans are divine. Does that sound very Jewish, very consistent with the New Testament? It was hard for people to accept one divine human in the form of Jesus, fully divine, fully human. And as I mentioned, it makes Judas out to be the hero, and he's the one that knows this special knowledge that can lead you to salvation. And we have just one copy. It's in this language called Coptic, which was Egyptian, where they borrowed the Greek letters to write it down with, added a few because they needed some other sounds. But one thing that's interesting about this is it uses names that are basically unknown or exceedingly rare in first century Palestine. I mentioned this briefly if you were here last year when I talked about names. And I'll show you just real briefly again that to refresh your memory. But before we do, let's talk about the Gospel of Peter, a forgery found in a 9th century monk's coffin in Egypt in 1880. So again, these documents were not circulating widely. And remember, the Christians were not in power early on. It's not like they were going around, burning documents and things like that. And it was the monks themselves that were preserving often anti-Christian works even. They were trying to preserve some Greek documents and things like that. This was warned against by some of these early church historians. And it's very anti-Semitic. It's one of those that just does not look at all like it could have been written by a first century Jew or about a Jewish Messiah. And it seems to know nothing about first century practices. It gets the names of rulers wrong, things like that. And it shows what can happen with legendary development. This is the one that you might have heard us mention before. When it talks about the resurrection, they add in that there's a talking cross. Jesus' head stretches past the clouds. You get this giant Jesus and this giant cross and things like that. So these people were very inventive here. It does view Jesus as God. That's one of the interesting things, is some of these early heresies fell prey more to Docetism, which is the belief that Jesus just wasn't even human. Of course he's divine, but he was, they were very anti-physical in this Gnostic movement, so they didn't want a physical Jesus. But here's a little bit about the names. You may have seen this slide last year, so I'm going to go through it real fast, but it's pretty cool because, for example, in Matthew 10 here, where they're choosing it's listing the 12 apostles chosen, and if there's no number, it's because the name is uncommon. It didn't make the top 100 list. And so we're going to show, as we're going through here, also the fact that if you're in about the top, dozen or so, there is a qualifier, because if you say Simon in first century Palestine, you're like, I forget the number, like 10% or more of the people were named Simon or something like that, according to records compiled by Jews. And they have a lot because they had these ossuaries, and they looked at all looked at all the names at the time and have compiled it. And this was not a Christian doing it, but a Jew. Anyway, so whenever it says Simon in the whole New Testament, it always has a qualifier. Simon the leper, Simon the tanner, Simon Peter. You get that there. You don't get it for Andrew. James, he's the son of Zebedee. John, his brother, implied also son of Zebedee, qualifier. No qualifiers for Philip and Bartholomew. Not one for Thomas. He didn't even make the top 100. Matthew, the tax collector, okay, he's number 9. Let's add in that qualifier. James, son of Alphaeus, has a qualifier, but not Thaddeus. So it's really quite striking. Like, it doesn't look like they would have been smart enough to make that up if they wrote it later and didn't live there and things like that. Yes?
I do have to mention this because I'm sure the slides you're working with are probably from a while back.
Yeah.
More recently, there's been a paper that's been put out by, I believe, Luke Vandewey and someone else that is about onomastic congruence.
I am aware of that, and I think Lydia McGrew has responded to that.
And
But
it
yeah.
actually does like a full Bayesian analysis on these names and like gives a like probability of the Gospels, Josephus, a well-researched historical novel from like the modern day, and like just not well-researched historical
Yeah.
novels of how well they match up to names of that time period. And it's like an 83% chance, I believe, for the Gospels, about a 6% chance for Josephus, and the other two are something that has to be written out in scientific notation because it's so small.
Oh, okay. Wow. So you're saying it's kind of affirming a case, and it's pretty rigorous.
Mathematically, it would be
Yeah.
incredibly unlikely to just chance upon the correct
Yeah.
a naming scheme as correct as the Gospels give
Yeah.
by orders of magnitude.
Yeah. At a minimum, it doesn't prove they're true or whatever, but it shows that these hyper-skeptical people going around saying, oh, it's probably written much later by people that weren't there. There's just no evidence for that. We have a lot of evidence against that kind of over-skeptical hypothesizing. And everywhere we can check the Gospels, they seem to be truth tellers, and I find that significant as well. But yeah, if you compare it to these Gnostic Gospels, to Seth's point, they really come out bad. So Gospel of Thomas, of course they're all going to mention Jesus or Mary. You have a few people they're repeating from the New Testament that match. But there's very little beyond that. And in particular, the Gospel of Judas was bad. It's got these names sort of from outer space that just have no intersection. I mean, you might think Adam and Eve, Michael and Gabriel, these are Old Testament names, right? But apparently people weren't naming their kids that in first century Palestine is the point. And they certainly weren't naming these other names. Seth is also another biblical name, obviously. But again, not a first century Palestine name. And even Jews in Egypt used totally different names than they did in the area of Israel, what I'm calling Palestine here. So, yeah, that fails. This is an interesting chart that McGrew put together where he shows early use of the Gospels, including the Gnostic Gospels and so forth. So I don't have the full key here, but yeah, most of them, the first ones at least, are listed here, so which early church father you're dealing with. If it's a check, it means that they quote from it, allude to it as though it's scripture. An X means they explicitly reject it. And a dot is just like they don't mention it one way or the other. So you can see that we have very good attribution from anybody that was like leading a church or writing and calling themselves Christian. You really have this strong referencing of the Gospels and Acts. These two red ones, Marcion and Valentinus, they're heretics, they're Gnostics. So yeah, I mean, Valentinus actually, even he's like, yeah, these are about Jesus. These are the source documents. He's just trying to distort things. And I've already mentioned how Marcion just wanted part of Luke, and that's it. And of course, he's got his own gospel over there. So kind of fast forward a little bit too fast. I mean, there is one, or you'll find a few cases where people think something should be treated as scripture, but it didn't make the final canonization later. But it's pretty rare. So I think Clement was referencing a couple. Now this one is really interesting. I read a book on this one. I didn't quite finish it, but it's pretty. I found it interesting because I remember when this first came out, and I was into apologetics fairly early on at the time, and really following it closely. And there were a lot of secular media sources and even some scholars that just really latched on to this finding. What it was is Harvard professor Karen King, who is a very good scholar, no doubt about that, in a prominent position. She came to a conference that happened to be it was in the Vatican. It was held that year. I think it was some kind of Coptic conference. So she announced in September 2012 that she had been given a papyrus claiming that Jesus had a wife. It had reference in there to this. And so people got all excited about this. but it turned out to be a forgery. But I just find it interesting because it shows how you can't always trust, what you hear, and you need to give things time. And then, sometimes Christians can be overzealous and put things out too that later turn out to be wrong. So that can run both directions, but we don't need to panic when you hear. The other thing that's interesting is really no Christian at the time, they were all like, yeah, if he had a wife, it wouldn't have been any threat to the truth of Christianity. It would just be very surprising because everybody would have talked about it, is really what everybody was saying. So this was an interesting case of people just sometimes wanting to believe something. So the claim was that we have this Coptic document written supposedly in the 4th century. It was presented. She didn't even present pictures. Something went wrong with her laptop, but she had days to get a hold of something. And for some reason, it was delivered in this kind of unusual way. And she would never tell anybody where she got the document. Okay, and it turned out to be, it was this con artist in Florida. And he basically just tricked her, and gave all this. And it's not a particularly clever forgery either, as you'll see in a little bit here. So some of the people, even at that conference or soon after, people that really knew Coptic well, they were pushing back and saying, this looks very suspicious. Where'd you get this? What's the deal with this? But Harvard and her were pushing pretty strongly. The Smithsonian Institute came out with something even that was kind of promoting it. But it came out eventually later that it was written on a papyrus that was old, but it wasn't really old enough. It was more of a medieval, not an ancient papyrus. But there were some early tests that kind of made them think. But all you have to do, it's real easy to get old papyrus. And you can write with an old kind of ink blot. So people knew, it's not that hard to get an old papyrus and just write on it with something you can't trace to modern ink. But by the time you got to, within 2 years, everybody admitted. I think it took a little bit longer for Karen King to finally admit, this is a forgery. But you still had Salon magazine, even after you had all this information, somehow promoting this. So I find it interesting that you can have such bad things like from the Newsweek article I mentioned or things like this. But one of the main guys that broke the story and wrote the book I read, he's not a Christian. He's a guy named Ariel Sabar, and he wrote for The Atlantic, and he found the guy that actually forged it and interviewed him a bunch and stuff. It's really interesting. The guy was Walter Fritz, a German immigrant. It's kind of bizarre. He worked in the pornography business and was doing all these shady things, but he had taken some classes, one class in Coptic or something. The document was just too late. And other people showed that, wait a minute, this dialect would have been obsolete by the 6th century, and it's written on papyrus that comes later. That makes no sense. There's all this kind of information that came out really quickly, but was somehow ignored by the experts at places like Harvard and the Smithsonian until it just became obvious. But this journalist, here's the book, a Harvard professor, a con man, and the Gospel of Jesus' wife. So it was supposedly taken from a codex, which is just like a book, basically. But the spacing was unrealistic. It would have been like the largest codex or book they've ever found in ancient times. And it had these, the writing went around a hole in the papyrus on one side, but not the other. I mean, how do you not notice things like this, right? And then it was people that knew a lot about these kind of, like Dan Wallace, who I mentioned before, who's seen all these ancient documents. He's like, I never see something with clean edges like this from ancient times. So there was a number of features that were problematic. There were some non-Christian scholars like Mark Goodacre at Duke University. He came out pretty early on pointing out some of the problems. And he was one of the ones that helped find that it turned out to be they also, in order to make this document, he went online and found a Gospel of Thomas translation, and he copied an error from that. a typographical error that originated in 2002. And so, I mean, people were pointing this stuff out. It took forever for that community to finally admit that it was a problem. Yeah, some people have suggested maybe he copied the idea from the Da Vinci Code, which not many of you, we won't focus on that much since not many of y'all have seen that or read that apparently, but that was one of the main themes, is that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene and that, which is really crazy. So yeah, the interesting thing about King, so she was like the head of the divinity department at Harvard, but she's sort of a postmodernist. She doesn't hold to the kind of evidential history that you and I would think is important. Apparently, at least she says history is not about truth, but about power relations. She thought the historian's priority should be to drop the association between truth and chronology. So I just kind of want to expose you guys to some of what's out there, even in the academy at places like Harvard. It may not be, we're at a STEM school here, and you guys are more grounded, but there are movements, intellectual movements out there that want to sort of deconstruct even things like history. And I know from people that are in the History of Ideas program here, they'll say, yeah, in that program, even at UTD, it also suffers from that kind of postmodernism. And so, yeah, some of the non-Christian people writing about this say, well, he probably chose Karen King to try to promote this because of her kind of, views of that type. She was wanting to latch onto it a bit too quickly there. She is a knowledgeable, I don't want to undermine her too much. She's a very knowledgeable scholar, and she's sincere. She would call herself a Christian, just more of kind of a liberal Christian. But yeah, she's kind of has different non-orthodox views, shall we say. All right, so in conclusion, we have excellent support for the traditional authors, having written the 4 canonical Gospels, but we have no good reason for thinking any of the other so-called Gospels that came later were really written by those authors. And so, yeah, all the early manuscripts we have the authorship in the documents. All the early church fathers, people leading churches in various places, refer to these documents very, very early on as scripture. And we have a geographical distribution of that spread over 1,800 or more miles. So it would be really hard to have faked that. And this is actually, if you compare this to evidence for authorship of other ancient works, it's head and shoulders above what you generally have. So there's really, unless you want to have this huge double standard, there's no reason to be skeptical about the traditional authors. And yeah, I think I found it interesting just because, yeah, I'm more of a science-oriented person, just trying to deal with reason. And I find it very troubling that in the academic environment today, sometimes people are moving away from that, and reason is getting undermined by, I think, more political considerations. All right, and yeah, these other Gospels don't really interlock with history. So again, the summary then would be, well, what are the chances that this anti-Jewish Greek Gnostic movement that we have no evidence of in the first century really got it right about Jesus versus the earlier documents that originated where Jesus was that followed the thought that he was in? I mean, Jesus was not this highly educated person, right? The Gospels admit that. The scribes are amazed that he knew the Bible well, obviously, and he was a great teacher, but he wasn't, being schooled by these prominent rabbis and Pharisees. He himself was the teacher. So it wasn't like he was out there getting all this Greek thought or Eastern thought and things that would fit into Gnosticism. He was a carpenter from this very humble area, Nazareth and Capernaum and so forth. It just makes no sense for them to recast Jesus in this way. So that's all I got today. Any questions or comments you guys have on any of this? All right, so next week, come for Bob Marks and Green, and thank you very much.